Well, welcome back. Our topic for this unit is testing, as well as other forms of assessment. So you should have read chapter 13 in Harmer before watching this video lecture, and if you haven't had a chance, just pause the video, take the time to read, and then come on back. And like we often do in this class, let's start by checking some of our assumptions and asking ourselves, what are some of the reasons for testing or assessing our students? Think about that for a moment. What's valuable about testing or assessing our students? Well, there are a variety of kinds of testing, and they're useful for different purposes. One of them is placement. We have to find out what a student knows or doesn't know to put them in the correct class or just to know their proficiency level. Another reason is progress, being able to see how far have they come in a certain amount of time. Also achievement, or sometimes known as an exit test. This is typically a cumulative test, sort of like a final exam at the end of a year or a semester to determine how much have students learned, how far have they come. Proficiency tests, they show us the level that a student has reached at any one time. So a common proficiency test used by universities and employers is the TOEFL or the TOEIC. The Access proficiency test is used by public schools for pre-K to 12. There are a variety of proficiency tests out there. Continuous assessment, rather than taking a snapshot in a moment kind of test, continuous assessment measures progress as it's happening throughout the learning period, not just at the end. And portfolio assessment is one kind of continuous assessment, keeping language portfolios for our students where they collect samples of their work over time, documenting overall progress and achievement. Continuous recording is also a kind of assessment, documenting who participates in class, how they keep up with their homework and their assignments, how are they progressing by documenting that. And some blend of these is useful in assessing most of our students. What do you think makes a good test? If you can think of a good test, what would that include? There are a few aspects of good tests. One is content validity. So if a test is valid, it does what it says it will. So if we say that a test is a good measure of reading ability, for example, then it should only measure reading ability. So a reading test may be less valid if we're having the student read out loud, because we know that when a student reads aloud, they become very concerned with pronunciation and they stop paying attention to comprehension. And also, we as their assessor may be listening to their pronunciation instead of their reading ability. So that's content validity, making sure that a test measures what it's intended to measure. Good tests are also reliable. And reliability in this sense means that any two people that are grading a test should come up with the same results. And also the same person taking the same test twice in the same setting and conditions, they should have the same result. So a test should be designed to minimize the effect of different grading styles, and also when there's a writing a portion of a test, rubrics are important because any two graders should get the same score to minimize subjectivity. Same thing with a speaking assessment. There should always be some kind of rubric that helps to minimize subjectivity. That leads to greater reliability. When we design assessments, we also have to consider what's called the washback effect, and that's the influence that a test has on the way that students are taught. So for example, the teaching sometimes ends up mirroring the test because teachers want their students to pass the test. Assessments can have an impact on how and what we teach because we want our students to be prepared for assessments and exams, and that can be problematic in what we think of as teaching to the test. Ideally, we're teaching what our students need to learn in general and not just to do well on an exam. So a well-designed assessment that can actually measure students' growth can help prevent this kind of teaching to the test. Testing can also impact motivation, both positively and negatively. Students may sometimes work harder than usual when they know that an exam is coming up, but then if they do poorly on an exam, that can sometimes demotivate our students. So when we're designing assessments, we want to keep both these things in mind to find a balance. We don't want to make tests too easy, but we also don't want students to fail unnecessarily. When we think about formal testing, there are three sort of most common types of questions. And the first of these is multiple choice or true or false. So in a multiple choice kind of question, students are given alternatives to choose from. So this question is probably going to be on testing verb tense or verb formation. You must blank here on time, and the student has to choose between the options A, B, C, and D. An advantage is that there's either one right answer or there's a best answer, and they're easy to grade. The hard thing about creating multiple choice questions is creating the distractors or the wrong answers in a way that they're neither too easy or neither too easy nor too difficult or too confusing. True or false questions are similar, and they're useful for reading and listening comprehension. Sometimes the washback effect of a multiple choice question is that students can become good at answering this kind of question without being good at using language in communicative ways. So they might become good at figuring out how to answer multiple choice or true or false and still be having a hard time using those same grammar forms when wanting to speak or write. Another kind of formal testing type of question is fill in the blank or close with or without a word bank. So this item seems to be testing the use of irregular past tense verbs, and the student must fill in the blanks. Last week I blank shopping and blank some new clothes. The thing we have to be aware of is that there can be more than one answer. So we have to think about what we would accept. In this example, how would you fill in those blanks? Probably last week I went shopping, but then bought some new clothes, got some new clothes, maybe even found some new clothes. You have to decide what's acceptable, and so and be careful in designing these to actually be testing the thing that you want to test. Close are similar to fill in the blank, but they put a gap at regular intervals, like every sixth word. So students have to produce a range of different words, not just one kind of word that you might be assessing. Sometimes for these kind of test questions, you would provide a word bank, and that's some good scaffolding for lower levels. For higher levels, maybe you don't. Or if you're differentiating instruction, maybe some students get the word bank and other students don't. Another kind of question type in formal testing is a transformation question. So students are asked to change the form of words and phrases to show their knowledge of syntax and grammar. So in this example, how would you rewrite it using the word lend? Could I borrow $5? Probably, could you lend me $5? So the students needs to know both the meaning of borrow and the meaning of lend, and then how to use them in grammatical constructions. These can be very hard to write, but they are effective at testing students' use of grammar. So far today we've talked about tests, part of what's known as formal assessment. And until recently, education has been based on a sort of transmission model of instruction. That involved feeding discrete facts to be learned by students. So in this picture, the teacher's dumping facts and figures and rules and behavior sort of through a funnel into the child's head, and the child then spits those things back out. And really, there's not a lot of critical thinking or analysis or creation happening. And this was true of language teaching as well. Students were taught a lot of rules and facts about language, but there was a lack of focus on using language in communicative and creative ways. Luckily, we've evolved since then, and we know that there are more active and dynamic mental processes involved in learning. So we now look at teaching and learning from this constructivism viewpoint. we know that students learn new information in content areas by constructing personal meaning and prior knowledge. So when we connect students' learning to their real lives and experiences, they learn better. And language is better learned when we integrate the 4 skills. So students learn best through integrative experiences that involve listening, speaking, reading, and writing, rather than just trying to work on discrete aspects of language or content. You're probably also familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. We want our students to be able to do all of the things as we move up the pyramid. So our assessments shouldn't just be assessing whether our students can do things at the bottom, like memorize vocabulary, but be able to describe, to apply, to analyze, to be able to use English, to evaluate, to create. So we want to think about moving up that pyramid when we think about assessment as well, whether that's formal, informal, or authentic assessment. So with the constructivist understanding of learning, and also with Bloom's taxonomy in mind, we now understand the importance of informal assessment and not just formal testing. Informal assessment allows teachers to track the ongoing progress of their students regularly and often. And teachers are doing this constantly during the course of the lesson. They're trying to see who's getting it and who is not. It can provide a more well-rounded picture of students' skills, abilities, and ongoing progress regularly, often. With informal assessment, there's 2 commonly used methods: performance-based assessment and portfolio assessment. Now, both of those methods utilize typical classroom activities to measure progress toward curricular objectives. And they involve monitoring and recording by teacher observation and student self-assessment. So remember, you're going to be assessing progress on both content objectives and language objectives. And you have to keep your eyes on both of those 2 prizes. Everything should map back to those learning objectives. And in terms of monitoring and observing, classrooms where you have a teacher assistant or a clinical student, those other people in the classroom, they can help with informal assessment. It's not easy to have your eye on everyone to see how they're progressing. So in terms of performance-based informal assessment, these are activities that you would typically do in the classroom, but that serve as a snapshot assessment of students' progress. And there's a lot of different kinds. So it could be, again, these are typical activities you'd be doing in the classroom, but when you use them as an assessment, you formalize them and you use them as a way to assess your students' progress. So they could just be reading with a partner, retelling a story, role-playing, giving descriptions or instructions using visual or written prompts, oral reporting to the whole class, telling a story by using a sequence of 3 or more pictures, completing dialogue or conversation through written prompts. Could be a debate, either one-on-one or taking turns in small groups, some kind of brainstorming activity, completing incomplete stories, playing games, and always using a scoring rubric, if an oral scoring rubric for oral activities, or if they're reading or writing activities, a different kind of rubric. But the rubric really helps you to standardize how you're tracking progress. Portfolio-based informal assessments are similar in their authenticity, but they track progress over time rather than as a snapshot in one moment. They can be used throughout the entire year, and they involve systematic collection of things like a sample of written student work. So that could be stories or completed forms or exercise sheet, any kind of written work. Drawings representing their knowledge and their proficiencies, recordings of oral work. So if students do a role play or a presentation or an oral account, record those so that you have those as part of a portfolio. Maybe even just the teacher description of student accomplishments, keeping those together in a portfolio. It could also be formal test data, checklists, rating sheets. The idea is that you're collecting the same kind of thing over time. So if it's samples of written work, you're collecting stories throughout the school year, you're completing their exercise sheets throughout the school year, etc., so that you can see progress on the same kind of thing over time. Additionally, authentic assessment gives students an opportunity to demonstrate their learning or their mastery of learning objectives by performing some kind of task. So authentic assessment can provide opportunities for higher order thinking, for meaningful and challenging tasks, for them to show the depth and breadth of their proficiency. It can involve some amount of self-assessment. And it usually involves them constructing responses and applying their learning to problems that mirror their classroom activities in authentic ways. So maybe an assessment looks like activities that students have done in class before, but this time they're being assessed with more intentionality and systematicity. Looking at types of alternative assessments, about authentic assessments, I'll go through a few of them, but this is not an exhaustive list. There's probably many more, and teachers already use these types of activities in informal ways. So when we use these as assessments, we're really just formalizing them in a systematic way. So maybe your video or audio recording, you've got a clipboard where you're making notes on points that map back to those objectives. Oral interviews can be good for our students who are pre-writing, too young to write, or they're beginners who can't write much in English yet. So maybe students respond orally to some tailored questions, and then the teacher probes to ensure their comprehension or the command of specific aspects of the language. Story or text retelling, where students read or listen to a text and then they recall the main ideas or selected details. And that really does resemble a classroom activity, but what makes it an assessment is that systematic collection of recording of information about the performance of the student. And all levels of English proficiency can participate, because your higher level ELLs can read the story, and then the lower level student can maybe retell it either in their first language or in English. A writing sample is another good kind of authentic assessment. It can be using expressive or narrative or expository, informative, or persuasive kinds of texts. A variety of genres can be utilized: postcards and letters, journals, etc. And that can be writing that the student is intended to do right then and there, or do later, given as an assignment and then turned in at a later time. Projects and exhibitions can also be great assessments. So displays or models of buildings or objects, role plays, simulations, presentations, etc. Could be done individually or as a small group. Any of these are great assessments, again, as long as they're systematically involving a rubric and you're watching their progress on these things over time. Similarly, experiments and demonstrations or constructed response items. So this is where a student reads or reviews textual materials and then responds to a series of open-ended questions. This is really important for eliciting comprehension and higher order thinking, and helps them to focus on how students apply information as opposed to how much they recall of what has been taught. So not just being able to spit facts back, but to be able to apply and synthesize them using that higher order thinking. And that's authentic because students can draw on thinking and reasoning skills that they're using in the classroom as well. Teacher observations are good for a kind of authentic assessment, so it can involve spontaneous and planned classroom activities. You want to be observing students' use of academic language, their higher order thinking skills, both in the context of a task-oriented discussion. And again, systematically making record of observations over time, noting changes over time of students' performance. Maybe you're looking at the same set of variables, but once a month you're checking in and observing on these things. Again, portfolios are really useful as a purposeful collection of student work intended to show progress over time. Sometimes you're selecting the items for the portfolio, sometimes the student is. Again, using a rubric to be measuring progress. Well, that is it for this unit, so make sure you have a look at the task list for all of the activities, and I will see you next time.